Welcome back. Now, the US plan to build a missile defense system in the Czech Republic and Poland has given rise to intense controversy in Europe. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel has called for a united Europe in dealing with this plan, saying there must be an attempt to prevent splits in Europe on all issues. For their part, members from the European Parliament considered the plan complete nonsense. Well, let's rejoin our guests now. In Moscow, Dr. Pavel Felgenhauer, a leading defense analyst. In Washington, Dr. Charles Kupchan, a professor of international relations at Georgetown University. And in London, Dr. Ian Davis, co-executive director at the British American Security Information Council. Pavel Felgenhauer in Moscow, let me start with you, because the Americans say that this system is no threat to Russia. So how does Moscow try and sell its message to Europe, and can it engage with Europe on this issue?
Well, our military leaders, our generals, more or less grudgingly admit that these particular announced 10 interceptors cannot possibly threaten Russian nuclear deterrent. But the argument that's really coming from Russian officials that first the Americans will maybe deploy those interceptors, and then having already a base, they'll deploy something else and then something else. And basically it boils down to that Russia does not have a say, meaning it doesn't have a veto on deployment of military infrastructure, as we say, in former Warsaw Pact states near our borders. First, it may be not a threat, then it will be something more of a threat. And that's what all the argument is about. President Putin believes that he does not given the respect he believes he is due to Russia, and Russia is not given a control over military developments near its borders. And this may in the end mean that Russia as a military superpower will exist no more, and that's the big fear here in Moscow. We believe, our ruling elite believes, that if we're not a military superpower, then we're nothing.
OK, Charles Kupchan in Washington. Many observers are concerned that the US has failed to consult local people in Europe. It's failed to involve NATO. It's failed to involve the European Union. I mean, one Czech politician says the US public diplomacy has been a fiasco. Is he right?
Well, I really would agree, at least to some extent, that the U.S. put the cart before the horse. That is to say, rather than dealing with this collectively, they tended to go bilaterally to Poland and the Czech Republic. The politics in those two countries is divided about whether they even want to host the missile defense system, not to mention the European Parliament or the Germans or other countries. But I also think it's important to put this issue, the missile defense issue, in the broader context of a transatlantic relationship that's been quite troubled over the last 6 years. Iraq was the key issue over which the two partners divided, but you've now got Iran, should there be tighter sanctions. You've got Kosovo, should the province of Serbia become independent. You've got the issue of climate change. So I think the reaction that you're getting in Europe to the missile defense issue is particularly charged, because there is also discontent over U.S. policy on some of these different issues.
Ian Davis in London. Let's go back to those threats again from President Putin, because Russia hasn't specifically targeted missiles at Europe since the end of the Cold War. So how serious will European leaders be taking his threats?
I think they'll be concerned by it, but I would think that it's largely seen as rhetorical at the moment, and that he won't actually go through with those retargeting threats. Again, I think it's important to recognise that what we're looking at here is a system that's rather like the Maginot Line in the sky. It's, you know, the delivery of nuclear warheads via ballistic missiles is only one of the many delivery systems that are out there. And if we're talking about a rogue state threat, and at the moment that's normally equated with North Korea and Iran, you know, these countries could deliver a nuclear weapon in a different method to that. So, you know, it's you know, you're just deflecting the threat into another area. And we're talking about the United States has spent something of the region of $100 billion chasing this missile defense dream, you know, since the mid-1980s. It's now currently spending $10 billion a year. It's the biggest single weapon program in the United States, and for very little reward. And you know, Europe needs to look at it in a different context. Europe doesn't need to be part of this system. Europeans generally tend to have a different threat perception and look at different ways of meeting those threats. It's about political engagement. It's about using soft power within the European Union. And I think, you know, collectively Europe needs to come together and you know, maybe behind the scenes be telling both the Russians and the Americans to kind of back off a little on this question.
Charles Kupchan in Washington, Ian Davis has a good point there, doesn't he? Because this missile system doesn't have the unified backing of NATO. It's just a bilateral deal between the US, Poland and Czechoslovakia. I mean, is the US putting pressure on the so-called new Europe and bypassing the old European countries?
Well, there's no question that new Europe, the new democracies of Central Europe, have been more pro-American than the Western European countries. They backed Bush on the Iraq War. Most of them sent troops to Iraq. But I do think that over time, this is an issue that, if addressed correctly, will not divide the Europeans. I do think that when you extend the time horizon, there is a sense that we need to worry about ballistic missile defense. And if it's done right, if it's done right technologically, if it's addressed within the context of multilateral forums like NATO, like the EU, the Russians should be at the table as well, that down the road there could be a transatlantic consensus on this issue. But we're certainly not there yet. And my guess is that this is an issue that is not going to be resolved by the Bush administration, but very much handed off to the presidency that assumes power in 2009.
Pavel Felgenauer, a very brief response from you. Is President Putin's hardline response designed to play to a domestic audience, briefly?
No, I don't think so very much. Actually, there's one person and only one person, and Russia defines Russian foreign policy, and that's President Putin. He's not apparently running for re-elections. He's not really that much interested in the local audience. He's interested more in the international audience. And I believe that it's not only missile defense. I think right now Kosovo is making Putin as mad at the West and at the Europeans as the missile defense issue. So there's quite a number of issues, and there's a president who's really distressed by the response of the West, and it's not easy at all to reverse the present situation.
OK, gentlemen, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We have to leave it there. Pavel Felgenauer in Moscow, Charles Kupchan in Washington and Ian Davis in London. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and your suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. That's insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team here, goodbye for now.